My name is Dan Fanning. I am an average man of 31 years old. My wife, Kimberly, is 28 years old, 5'7", blonde with a killer figure. We met in college during my senior year, dated for 2 years, and got married after graduation. Rocketdyne, an airplane parts manufacturer, had already hired me when we got married. My best friend Brian met Kim's older sister Betty at our wedding. They started dating and got married a year later. Betty was a year older than Kim, with browner hair color, and about 2 inches taller than Kim. Brian was my height, about 6 feet, and weighed 180 pounds. Brian got a job at an up-and-coming software development company across town from my office. We bought houses next to each other in a very nice area that was between our 2 jobs. Betty and Kim worked part-time as accountants for several companies in a local shopping center. During the first 5 years of their marriage, Brian and Betty had 2 children. We weren't so lucky. 5 years into our marriage, Kim announced she was pregnant with our first child, Megan. Kim was so happy that we tried to have a baby for 5 years. We were tested, and my test results showed that I didn't have much chance of becoming a father. But the doctor indicated that under the right circumstances, it was possible. I will never forget the day Kim told me she was pregnant. She came into the living room and jumped onto my lap. She hugged me tightly and planted a huge kiss on my lips. She cupped my face in her hands, looked me straight in the eyes, and announced, "Well, Mr. Fanning, I'd like to announce that you're going to be a dad." I was delighted. I grabbed her tightly by the waist and asked, "Are you sure, dear? I mean, we've been trying for so long. That's for sure?" Kim simply smiled at me and nodded her head. "Yes, I found out today. It must have happened the night we watched adult movies with Betty and Brian. I know we truly lusted after each other that night." I remembered that night and nodded. "Oh yes, we were 2 animals that night, weren't we?" I laughed and hugged her again. The pregnancy proceeded normally, and Kim gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. We named her Megan, and for the next 3.5 years we had a wonderful life together. It all came to an end when Megan was preparing to enter pre-kindergarten. We had to give her various vaccinations required by the school and complete other various tasks. One of these tasks led to the downfall of our family. I had to take Megan to school for her blood test day. This test was to ensure that the school had an accurate record of each child's blood type in case of any emergency requiring immediate blood transfusion. This has now become a common practice due to the rise in foreign and domestic terrorist activities across the country. We arrived, and Megan began to cry as the nurse took a small blood sample. Then we both comforted Megan, and soon she stopped whining. The nurse looked at me and said, "Mr. Fanning, I can take a blood sample from you and also enter it into the database. This will let us know if we should use you or your wife as a blood donor for Megan if the need ever arises." I thought it was a good idea, so I let the nurse take a sample of my blood. Rolling up my sleeve and taking Megan's hand, I thought no more about it and left the school. Megan and I went and had ice cream together. 2 days later, I was in my office when the nurse called me. It took me a while to recognize her when she told me her name. She said she was the school nurse who took the blood samples. I asked, "Oh, hi. Are the samples okay?" "No, there's something wrong with the samples. I really don't know how to tell you this. This happens from time to time to the father of a child we test." "What's happening?" I asked. "Megan has blood type O+. Your blood type is AB." "So what? This just means that my wife, Kim, is a future blood donor, right?" "Well, Mr. Fanning, no. This means there is no way you could be Megan's biological father." The light in the room around me dimmed, my ears began to ring, and the hand holding the telephone receiver began to tremble violently. "I'm sorry. What? I mean that? What the hell do you mean I'm not Megan's father?" I gasped. There is no medical way for a type AB to be the parent of a type O child. Blood just doesn't work that way. I was hoping you would tell me that Megan was adopted, but based on your answer, I can tell that is not the case. "I'm so sorry that my words have such consequences for you," the nurse said, apologetically. I don't remember if I answered her. I just remember realizing later that I was still holding the phone in my hand with the dial tone blaring in my ears. This means Kim is deceiving me, or at least she was hooking up with someone when she got pregnant. She never changed her attitude or disposition towards me. I never noticed anything to indicate that she slept with anyone else. How can I find out who she was with? Is she still dating him? Could she deceive so easily that she would never give me any indication that anything was wrong? I thought about it for a couple of hours all day in the office. I didn't want to go home yet because I still saw the red color of rage in my eyes. I went to the park and started walking along the path around the lake. I had walked about half a mile when it dawned on me. Megan is not my child. Yet I paid for her care and upbringing while some idiot Don Juan slept with Kim and left me with the expenses. I loved Megan to death, but she was no longer my daughter. How could Kim lie to me for so long about something so important? Why did she use me this way? I got angrier and angrier the more I thought about this whole situation. I calmed down and began to think about what to do. Plan. I needed a plan. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is take Megan to the city clinic and get DNA tests done on her and myself. This would be the final proof of Kim's deception. The second thing to do is to find out whether this deception has ended or is still ongoing. I will need a recording device for the cordless phones in our house. Let's see if she talks to this asshole about their daughter. Let's see if she's even dating him now. If they meet, I can later figure out how to get audio or video evidence of these meetings, and then I can decide what the appropriate response is for both my cheating wife and the asshole sleeping with her. But first, about the main thing. I drove to the nearest radio room and found a small recording device that turned on when any of the house cordless phones were turned on. So if she was talking to him, I would have caught it. The sound will be recorded to the memory card. I could play the contents of the memory card on my laptop. With the recording device and a dozen memory sticks in my shopping bag, I drove home. It was Kim's day when she went shopping at the mall to get data for reporting. I was several hours ahead of her, enough time to set up a recording device and call the city clinic to arrange a DNA test. Kim returned home about 5 minutes after I finished my business installing the device. She picked Megan up from preschool on her way home. She was the most ordinary, loving wife. She hugged me and kissed me. I pulled away from her because I didn't want any intimacy with her. Fury was still seething inside me. She stopped and looked at me. "What's wrong? Are you angry about something?" "No, I'm just very tired this evening." I lied. "Okay, then, why don't you go sit and play with our beautiful daughter until I get dinner ready?" Kim suggested. At this moment, I was simply seething with anger. Our beautiful daughter? Who was she kidding? As I sat in the living room with Megan on my lap, I began to really study her features for the first time. Maybe something in the facial features, and I have an idea of who the father is. I noticed her chin, nose, and eyes. Maybe I'll see a guy with one or more of these traits. In fact, I swore I knew someone who had the same upturned nose and the same intense brown eyes. But who is it? Somehow I made it through dinner and went to bed a few hours before Kim. I pretended to be asleep when she got into bed. She touched my shoulder, but I didn't respond. She sighed and rolled over. Soon I heard her breathing deeply. I tossed and turned most of the night. I was still tormented by the thought that I knew those eyes from somewhere. I was chilled with the desire to find out who Megan's father was and to punish both my cheating wife and the poor idiot who fathered my supposed daughter. Morning has come. At breakfast, I told Kim that I had the day off today and wanted to take Megan to the park. She instantly agreed. The speed of this agreement gave me pause. Was she going to contact her lover while I was out with my supposed daughter? I took Megan to the clinic where we had a mouth swab taken for DNA testing. Then I took Megan to the park and found that she was having so much fun on the rides that she completely forgot about the clinic. That evening, Kim said she had a committee meeting at church and would go with Betty and Brian. She left the house at 7 and went next door to Betty and Brian. As soon as Kim left, I put Megan to bed and went to the corner of the basement where I set up a telephone recorder. I took the flash drive out of the tape recorder and inserted a new one. I took the memory stick to my work desk in the basement. I took my laptop, put it on the table, and connected the flash drive. With trembling hands, I pressed the play icon on the laptop screen. The first few conversations were normal household chores. She talked to the painting contractor, arranged for Megan to sign up for ballet class, and all that. The fifth conversation took place between Kim and Betty. Betty said, "Hey, baby, are you ready for tonight?" "Yes, I can hardly wait," Kim answered. "Well, I hope it takes time. The last 4 times were unsuccessful. Brian is already starting to get tired." "Brian is a good guy, and you're lucky to have him," Kim said. "Are you sure Dan doesn't suspect anything?" Kim giggled. "Nothing special. He has no idea. And I want it to stay that way." "Do not worry. He didn't learn from us last time, so he won't learn anything this time either," Betty answered. "Okay, see you in the evening." What the heck? Was Betty involved in this too? Did she condone Kim's cheating? Brian also apparently participated in this in some way. In fact, it sounded like they were involved in arranging illicit meetings with Kim and her lover. I've been so depressed these past few days that I almost turned to Brian for advice, as he was my oldest and dearest friend. Now, after hearing this conversation, I'm glad I didn't do it. Of course, at that moment, I had no idea who I could trust. I was humiliated by the thought that my best friend and my wife's sister seemed to be conspiring against me. I was mad as hell to think that they condoned this whole thing. I needed time to understand all this in more detail. The DNA test took 3 days, then another 2 days for the results to be mailed to me at my office. On the 5th day, the clinic results arrived on my desk. I gathered my courage and opened the envelope. It was as bad as I thought it would be. There was no way Megan could be my daughter. I dropped the report and cried into my hands for several long minutes. Pulling myself together, I called my boss and told him I wasn't feeling well. I left for the day and went to my area. I was surprised to see Brian's car parked in my driveway. The back of Kim's car was visible through the open garage door. I parked my car about half a block away and dialed my home number from my cell phone. Several rings passed before Kim picked up the phone. She should be able to tell from the caller ID that it's me calling from my cell phone. "Hi, darling. I am very busy now. Can I call you back in about 30 minutes? Kim spoke as if she had lost her breath. "Did I catch you at the wrong time?" I asked. "Yes, I glue wallpaper on the walls of the 3rd bedroom. I'm going to remove the old ones and put on new ones. I've already coated the roll and can't let the glue dry right now." In the background, I thought I heard a man's voice whispering, "Finish the conversation with Dan and let's finally get down to business." I could tell Kim suppressed a giggle and, after a moment's hesitation, said, "Dan, I really need to run. Let me call you in half an hour, okay?" All I could say was, "Fine." Just as I was about to hang up, I heard Kim's voice. "Dan? Or call me in an hour. Thank you, darling." I sat in my car, despairing over this fresh evidence. Brian's car was parked outside my house. From the whispers and giggles I heard, Kim was clearly entertaining someone. Could Brian be so rude as to actually bring Kim's lover into our home? Did she sleep with him in our bed? Suddenly, even worse thoughts came into my head. Was Brian more than just an instigator in this? Can he be a member? It seemed impossible because Betty was obviously aware of everything Kim was doing. Betty, of course, would not have condoned Brian having sex with Kim. God, it was so disgusting to think that one sister would knowingly allow her husband to take advantage of another sister. But what is Brian involved in? Obviously, he knew a lot about what was going on. I was deep in thought about all this when I saw Brian leave my house and get into his car. He drove in the other direction and disappeared around the corner. What the heck? Where's the other guy? Still there? A few minutes later, Kim walked out the door and took the mail out of the mailbox. She was wearing a robe and her hair was wet, as if she had just stepped out of the shower. Could it be Brian? Did Brian make love to her? I cannot believe this. I must be wrong about all this. But what other answer could there be? At this moment, I was completely demoralized. My best friends, my wife, my daughter, are all lying. I returned to the radio room and bought a sound-activated audio recorder. As I was driving to make this purchase, my cell phone rang. It was Kim. Hello, dear. I'm done with wallpaper for today. I'm going to run out, get my hair cut, and pick up Megan. I'll bring some pizza home. I just don't feel like cooking tonight. All I could answer was, okay, see you later at home. I returned to the house to find that there were no sheets on the bed in the master bedroom. Apparently, they were in the washing machine, which was still running. So, is she and the asshole using our marital bed for their fornication? I thought. I put the new recording device under the bed. It used the same memory cards as the telephone voice recorder. I also replaced the memory card in my phone recorder and took it with me when I left the house. I left the house and went to the park. I inserted the memory card into the laptop and heard my wife's first phone conversation of the day. This was with Brian. "Hello, Kim." "Hi, darling," Kim answered. "Is it safe to come now?" "Oh yeah, Dan went to work and we have all morning to make the baby." "Great. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Kim giggled and I heard the phone hang up. So Brian has sex with Kim. I wonder what Betty will say about this. What the hell? Based on other conversations I've heard, Betty knows this. What the hell is going on? At this moment, my confusion was complete. I stayed in the park until it was my usual time to return home from work. I arrived at the house to find my wife and supposed daughter cooking dinner and laughing at some cartoon that was playing on the TV in the kitchen. I was sad to hear that laughter. He will soon disappear. One more piece of evidence, and I would have started divorce proceedings and sued whoever is Megan's father to get my money back for her upbringing and future child support. I'll bide my time until then. I waited 4 days until the weekend to change the memory card in the voice recorder under my bed. I had to wait until Kim went to the grocery store on Saturday. On at least one of the 4 days, the sheets on the bed smelled fresh and clean, as if Kim had washed them again. I took the laptop and memory card down to the basement, plugged it in, and pressed play. The conversation and sounds I heard tore my heart. Brian was definitely saying that. It was definitely Kim, her voice continuing the warm and loving conversation with Brian after that. She clearly wanted Brian to be the father of all her children. Their conversation confirmed that Megan belonged to Brian, not me. This conversation decided their fate. It will take me until Tuesday to plot my revenge, but it would be worth the wait. On Monday, I informed my lawyer of the facts. He began preparing divorce papers and some other civil legal documents for delivery on Tuesday. I went to the bank, withdrew half of the funds, and opened new accounts at another bank. I canceled all my credit cards. I informed Kim's auto loan company that I would no longer be responsible for her debts. I wrote a check for $100,000 from my home equity line and deposited it into my new account. As of Monday evening, I was financially cut off from Kim and had provided her with half of our marital assets, as my lawyer had instructed me to do. A voice recorder under the bed revealed another affair between the betrayed spouses on Monday. A recording of the phone call showed they planned to do it again on Tuesday. I collected all the papers from the lawyer at 3 p.m. and went to the park. I just sat and stared straight ahead for over an hour. Yes, that was it. If I hadn't ended this today, I don't think I could stand another humiliation. I would fall apart and do things I would regret. I drove home and sat in the kitchen, waiting for Kim to arrive. I had the divorce papers in my car, and I'll pick them up as soon as Megan falls asleep. Kim burst in at 5 p.m. with Meghan and Tao and said, "Megan, honey, go to your room and put your things away. I need to talk to Dad for a minute." Megan hugged me, kissed me on the cheek, and obediently went to her room. Kim looked at me and smiled. She laughed and hugged me. She said, "Dan, I have wonderful news. We will become parents again." I was numb. I couldn't believe what I just heard. Kim tried to pass off Brian's baby as mine again. Was Brian going to take advantage of all the extra benefits and leave me to raise my kids? And Kim agreed with this. It was obvious that she no longer loved me and probably hadn't for at least 9 months before Megan was born. I swear to God, this time I am not going to endure this humiliation. I jumped up and pushed him away from me with all my might. She hit the wall hard and slid to the floor. Staring at me with wide eyes, she said, "Dan, What happened? Why did you do that? Aren't you excited about our new baby? I started laughing hysterically. Our new baby. Our new baby. Who the hell are you trying to fool, you? I know that bastard you're wearing belongs to Brian. And I know that Megan is not mine either. Did you really think that you could live your life cheating and make me pay the bills for the bastard children? Did you really think that I was so stupid that I would never know? Kim put her head in her hands and rocked back and forth. Dan, please let me explain. It's not like you... Shut up. I've had enough of your lies. You've been lying to me for at least 4 years. No more. Kim tried to get up and slid back down. How do you know? We were so careful. I never meant to hurt you or... What part of shut up didn't you understand? You are nothing more than a slutty woman. If it weren't for the fact that all your children are bastards, I would take them away from you as an unfit mother. Kim recoiled in shock. It shouldn't have been this way, Brian said. Don't say his name again, ever. Not in my presence. I want to know one thing. How many times have you two slept? Probably hundreds, huh? Kim shook her head and tried to answer between sobs. We only did this maybe 10 times. I ask again. How many times? I screamed. Okay, 12 times over the last 4.5 years. Are you pleased to know this? I again saw a red veil before my eyes. Brian was actually trying to push another one of his bastards into my care. Kim served him for almost half of my entire married life. It was enough that this man deserved to be beaten. I looked at my watch. Brian should be arriving at his house any minute. I ran out the back door, heading towards Brian's house. Kim screamed at me from the doorway to, please wait and let her try to explain and please not hurt Brian. All I heard was her say Brian's name. Don't hurt him? Damn it, I want to kill him right now. That would be good. She ran back into the house. I heard Brian and Betty's phone ring as I approached the fence in their driveway. Kim tried to warn them that I was coming to get some ass. I saw Brian's car turn the corner and he pulled into the driveway. Just then, their phone stopped ringing. Betty must have answered the phone. Brian opened the car door and got out. I came out from behind the bushes. He saw me and smiled. Hi, Dan. How are you? He suddenly froze when he saw my face. He realized that I knew. He never finished his sentence because I hit him. Around this time, Betty ran out of their house screaming at me. Dan, please let us explain. This is really not what you... I stepped over Brian and settled between his legs. Brian, you bastard. I know you've slept with Kim at least 12 times. Kim ran up. Dan, oh please stop. Don't hurt him anymore. Please, we all owe you an explanation for this mess. Could you please pull yourself together? Pull yourself together? You got pregnant by him not once but twice, and are trying to pass off his children as mine? And you want me to pull myself together? Fuck you. Either way, you've probably slept with half the men in the area. I'm sure you and your sister both enjoyed sharing it. Kim could only shake her head at this outburst of anger. She looked at Brian and started crying again. I looked from Kim to Betty and said with contempt, I hope you two have had your fill of your shared lover, because he will never service either of you again. With these words, I slowly walked back towards the house. I went upstairs and took a shower. I threw the clothes I was wearing on the bathroom floor, went downstairs and poured myself a beer. I sat down at the kitchen table and drank my beer. I heard sirens and squealing tires next door. I heard Betty and Kim scream, and then scream again, just before the ambulance pulled out with sirens blaring. They must have been telling the authorities how crazy I was. Who cares? Eventually, 2 police officers came through the kitchen door with guns drawn. The larger one pointed a gun at me and ordered me to lie down on the ground and not move. Another handcuffed me and read me my rights. They didn't say a word the whole way to the county jail. I didn't say a word about what happened. If the police asked me a question, I either answered yes or no. I gave them my name and address. I asked my lawyer. I wonder what tomorrow will bring. I guess I'll make time for attacking Brian. I'm sure the women will come up with a story to explain my rage without giving up on their shared lover. The next morning, I was charged with assault and attempted murder. I look around the courtroom and see Kim and Betty sitting in the front row. They look like they haven't slept all night. I laugh to myself. Welcome to the club. I didn't sleep much last night either. My lawyer doesn't find me guilty. He wants me to consider pleading temporarily insane when we get closer to trial. I told him I would think about it because I knew I must have been crazy at the time I caused all this physical damage to Brian. I really don't remember much of it now. The judge set my bail at $150,000. Kim and Betty whispered to each other and then nodded in agreement. They stood up and left the hall. I was put back into custody while my lawyer tried to arrange bail for me. I was locked up for 4 days. All my anger went away. It was replaced by a cold emptiness in which nothing was felt for anyone. My lawyer said Kim contacted him on the 3rd day and wanted to meet him. I told him that everything is fine, but don't bind me to any obligations. The lawyer shows up this morning and tells me that Betty and Kim wanted to post bail for me. Brian, Betty, and her will drop all charges and refuse to testify if I just meet them in Brian's hospital room. So if I agree to the meeting, I can be out of jail by 3 p.m., and the meeting can take place at 5 p.m. I agree, but I wonder what nonsense the 3 of them will try to sell me. My lawyer escorts me out of jail at 3:30 and offers to go to my house so I can change and shower. Kim gave him the key and assured the lawyer that no one would be home to cause me any trouble. I showered, shaved, and put on comfortable pants and a golf shirt. I went to my car and pulled out the audio recordings of the bedroom conversations, as well as the divorce and court papers. I put them in my laptop bag along with my laptop. Now we went to the hospital. We arrived just before 5 o'clock and went straight to Brian's room. As we entered, the muffled conversation going on in the room stopped. Brian just stared at me. The women tried to smile. I stood in the doorway, looking at my soon-to-be ex-wife, her immoral sister, and my once best friend. They looked at me with sad eyes. I didn't see any anger in any of them. I saw sadness. What the hell does this all mean? Why are they sad because I found out what a bunch of liars and scammers they are? There was dead silence for a long time. Finally, my lawyer cleared his throat and said, "You ladies asked for this meeting, so would you like to explain why we are here?" Kim stood up from the chair next to Brian's bed. She looked ashamed and didn't know where to start. Finally, she said, "Dan, we're so sorry. Brian and I had sex, but only to have a baby. There was and is no love between us. Betty knew about all this, and it was even her idea. Please forgive us all for lying to you. We never wanted you to find out. We hoped you would go to your grave thinking that Megan and our new baby were yours. That was my hope and prayer. Have a child? What the hell are you talking about?" I asked. "Well, after all these years, it became obvious that you and I would never be able to conceive a child. I was starting to desperately need a child. I had many long, heartbreaking conversations with Betty about this. She was the one who came up with the idea that Brian was obviously a really prolific guy. You and he are very similar, so a child from either of you could easily pass for the child of the other. It took her a while to convince Brian that if he could help me conceive, our marriage would actually be stronger and more fulfilling. She played on his deep feelings for you as his best friend, and he finally agreed to the idea. So about 5 years ago, we started meeting for sex during my ovulation period. Betty allowed us to use their bedroom for these sessions. She was great at it. After 6 attempts, I became pregnant with Megan. Brian was really happy that he was going to be a father again, but he knew he could never let you know that. Betty was also happy that she gave us such a wonderful gift. I wanted you and me to have a child. Dan and I did everything possible to achieve this. Sex was just to have a baby. It was not for pleasure, love, or lust. This was for our Megan. I recently decided that I wanted another child, a boy if possible, so we agreed to have another child. I'm so sorry you found out about this and came to the wrong conclusions." "So, the sex was only to have a child?" I asked. "Yes. And you only did this until you found out you were pregnant?" "Oh, yes." I looked at Betty. "And you knew about it, and you were okay with it?" Betty smiled sadly and nodded her head. "We tried to give you two the greatest gift, I'm so sorry this was received so poorly. We had to fill you in on this and hope you would understand. I understand why you're so upset. I looked at Betty intently and sighed. Betty, I don't get upset about anything anymore. After knocking the wind out of Brian, I lost all anger. I'm just sorry you got dragged into this too. Betty looked at me questioningly. What do you mean? Betty, I have evidence that it was more than just having a baby. Brian's eyes became worried. Kim started wiping her eyes again, and Betty looked at me curiously and asked, What evidence? Kim sobbed. There is no evidence. I am not like that. I did this for the children. Brian nodded his head in agreement with Kim. I shook my head and answered Kim sadly. No, Kim. You may have thought so, but an objective person hearing you two talk would have thought differently. This may have been how it all started, but things are different now, isn't it? I don't understand what you mean. Kim glared back at me, now angry that her motives were being questioned. Okay, if you want to prolong this farce, then let's just present the evidence and ask a few simple questions. Your answers to these questions will determine the fate of everyone in this room and the future of all our children. I reach it into my laptop bag and pull it out the laptop and memory, stick from under the tape recorder under the bed. This conversation was recorded in our bedroom for the last time. This was the straw that broke my back and made it impossible to forgive Kim or Brian. From the recording, it was clear even to a fool that they were doing this not for the sake of the children, but for their own pleasure. I turned off the film. Betty's eyes got bigger and bigger as the tape played. Well, Kim, this conversation seems to indicate that you are ready to make love to him anytime he wants it and in any way he wants it. Yes or no? I asked her. No. I don't know. It really sounded like you two became real lovers. I'm not happy with what I heard. I need to think about this a little. I pressed play again, and the voices returned. Betty's eyes were now burning holes into her sister and Brian. I turned off the recording again. So, Kim, I'm guessing you two have come up with some new way to get you pregnant? At this point, Kim simply lowered her head. Betty walked over to Kim and stood in front of her. She grabbed her sister by the shoulders and shook her. I give you the greatest gift one sister can give another, and what do you do with it? Betty let go of Kim and stepped back, then punched her. I intervened. Now I'm going to ask this once and once only. Did you sleep after you found out you achieved your goal of having a baby? Kim sobbed. No, never. I sighed and turned the recording back on. We heard Brian ask Kim, when are you going to tell Dan you're pregnant again? I'm glad we've been able to meet a couple of times since you found out. It was nice to be with you and know that we were going to have a baby. Kim sighed. Perhaps on Tuesday. This will give us another chance to be together. Betty sobbed and ran out of the room at those last words on the tape. I turned off the recording. Well, Kim, obviously you slept a few times after you found out you were pregnant. Kim exclaimed, You do not understand. When two people create such a miracle as a child, they share a certain amount of devotion and affection, but it was never meant to replace you or Betty in our lives. We did this to feel close to each other for the wonderful things we had. I stopped her. You, traitor. You slept with him for sex. Don't bully me about this connection. Now, if you are done with this meeting you requested, I would like you to at least be honest enough to honor your agreement to drop the charges and refuse to testify against me. Brian and Kim nodded in agreement. I reached into my laptop bag and pulled out the divorce papers. Handing them over to Kim, I said, You were a good wife, but not an honest wife. You lied, cheated, and cuckolded me. Notice of divorce due to irreconcilable differences is hereby given to you. If you challenge this, you will hear this recording and others in court. You understand this? Kim nodded and took the papers. I also told her about the change in bank account and credit card status. It looks like Betty and Brian posted bail, so Kim was not yet aware of the change in her financial situation. I turned to Brian. I handed him the papers. You idiot. These papers indicate that I'm suing you for the return of child support. Your illegitimate child. You will pay me $50,000 and set up a college fund for Megan and that new bastard you have on the way. We will trust Reverend Fuller, our church pastor, to manage the fund. and you will tell him exactly why you should grant this trust. I want our church members to know what a slime both you and Kim are. You also admit to Megan that you are now her dad. Understood?" Brian nodded. "I'm sure Betty will have a few more things for you to do, but that's between you and her. As for Betty and Kim, I hope someday she can forgive you, Kim. Now I have to run and get Megan. I have to tell her that I'm not her dad anymore." Kim looked almost panicked. "No, please don't do this. She's only 4 years old. She won't understand. Can't we wait a few years and then tell her? You just want to keep lying, don't you, you pathetic piece of shit?" "No, this will stop now. I'll tell her today and end this. Whether you two want to fulfill your responsibilities in this matter is your business, not mine," I yelled at her. With these words, I left the hospital room and never looked back. Brian tried to back out of our deal not to testify and to drop the charges. I jumped bail and didn't show up for my first court hearing. Once the judge revoked my bail and issued a bench warrant, I returned to serve 3 months. Of course, Betty and Brian lost the money they put up for my bail. Brian eventually dropped his charges and refused any further interaction with the DA's office. But his actions cost him his wife. Betty divorced him within a year, his children, his home, half his property. As far as I know, Kim never saw him after that day in the hospital room. Just a few weeks, and Kim's happy home turned into ruins. At that moment, Kim lost her husband, lover, and sister. My name is Dan Fanning. I have aged several years. I'm now 36 and divorced from my ex-wife, Kimberly. I left the meeting with my wife, Kim, her sister, Betty, and my dorky brother-in-law, Brian. I discovered that Brian was the father of my daughter, Megan, and had gotten Kim pregnant again. I also discovered that Betty was a willing participant in this farce, and in fact it was she who came up with the idea that her husband should impregnate my wife, since it was not working out for me. After this whole ugly situation, I started calling them the Three Musketeers. The Three Musketeers posted my bail after I spent a few days in jail for beating up Brian. They asked that I attend a meeting with the three of them in exchange for them posting bail and promising to drop the charges and not assist the DA in building the case against me. The meeting was to take place in Brian's hospital room. I was in a meeting where I heard Kim's lame excuse that she was only using Brian to just make babies and that she only loved me. She told me that I was the only real father of our daughter and unborn child. Betty became unstuck when I played the audio of Kim and Brian's last contact in my marital bed in my home. She allowed Kim to use Brian to conceive a child, but was furious when she learned that Kim and Brian were apparently not just doing this to conceive a child, and that they continued to work out after Kim found out she was pregnant. I left the meeting after serving Kim with divorce papers and Brian with a claim for my expenses in caring for Megan since her birth. I went to preschool, picked up Megan, and took her home. While filing for my wife's divorce was difficult, this conversation I was about to have with Megan was bound to break my heart. I asked Megan to sit at the kitchen table and handed her a bowl of ice cream. She sat there, scooping up little pieces of ice cream with her spoon and licking the spoon clean. She looked at me with her innocent blue eyes and waited for me to say something. Why should the innocent suffer for the mistakes of the guilty? I was surprised. I shook off this feeling and began. "Megan, I need to talk to you about something very serious. I want to make sure you understand all of this, and I want you to know right now that nothing I'm about to tell you is your fault anyway. Fine?" I managed to finish before I had to wipe my eyes. "Yes, Dad. I understand. What's wrong? Where's Mom?" Megan said, looking around. "Mom is with Aunt Betty and Uncle Brian. Mom and Uncle Brian are the reason I need to talk to you. Honey, please stop eating your ice cream for a second and listen to me." I looked Megan straight in the eyes and continued. "Your mommy decided some time ago that Uncle Brian is your dad. So from now on, you have to call him Daddy. From now on, you will call me Uncle Dan. Fine? Why Dad?" "Well, just because your mom decided that Uncle Brian..." I mean, your new dad, Brian, was supposed to be your real dad. So from now on, I can only be your Uncle Dan. This doesn't mean I love you any less. I will always be by your side, but not like your dad. I had to stop there because my voice cracked. But Daddy, I want you to be my daddy, Megan howled. Stop, Megan. This simply cannot happen anymore. I'm not your dad. Brian is your dad. Now please go up the stairs to your room and wash your face. Megan ran up the stairs in tears. I heard her cry as she went to the bathroom to wash her hands and face. I was psychologically destroyed. I have no emotions left. I was devastated. I sat at the kitchen table and just looked at the floor. I didn't even hear Kim's car drive up to the house. She entered the house and saw me sitting at the table. She knew from my doomed look that I had told Megan that Brian was her father. Dan, how could you? She is only 4 years old. She just can't understand all of this, Kim exclaimed. Kim, just shut up. You brought this on yourself and affected innocent little Megan and me. I told Megan that Brian was her father and it was your decision. And I swear to God, it was your decision. Oh, Dan, you just don't understand why I did what I did or how little Brian means to me. I think not, and I really don't want to know at the moment. All I know is your baby is upstairs in tears, and there is nothing I can do to make him feel better. I suggest you take care of Megan's emotional needs while I take care of mine. With these words, I left the house and never appeared in it again. I heard from some friends that Betty filed for divorce from Brian, and Brian moved out of the area. He was too embarrassed by how our kind reverend at church talked about Brian's reason for setting up trust funds for Megan and the unborn child. I also heard that Betty told her parents why she was divorcing Brian and that her own sister was the cheater who set it all up. Betty and Kim's father refused to have anything to do with Kim. Their mother was at least polite to Kim, but stayed away from her because of her father's reaction. It turned out that their mother became addicted to the bottle to relieve the stress of dealing with her 2 daughters and husband. She would sometimes sneak out of her house to do something for Kim when Kim needed help. But she would have to sneak away, and naughty said, because dear Father wanted nothing to do with either who, nor with her dissolute actions. Kim contacted me about 2 weeks after I spoke with Megan. She said she would like to meet me at a local pub we frequented. She said that she just needed to explain herself to me and ask me for Christian forgiveness. I was not a devout Christian, but I did believe in Christian teachings. So I agreed to meet with her and at least listen to her point of view. I went into the pub around 2 p.m. It was very dark inside compared to the bright afternoon sun. It took me a few moments for my eyes to adjust. There was Kim, sitting at our favorite table, wearing a bright yellow sundress that I really liked on her. I slowly walked up to the booth. Okay, Kim, this is your meeting. I raised my hand and got the bartender's attention. I made a motion with my hand to indicate that I needed 2 fingers of the maker's mark. He nodded and put the glass on the table. It was nice to see you 2 again, he said, putting the glass on the table. It was nice to meet you, Frank. I responded with a sad smile. He left, leaving us in stony silence. Finally, Kim said, Dan, I have to explain to you what you heard and why you heard it. There's really nothing to be upset about. This farce was already beginning to irritate me. Let me see. You're sleeping with your sister's husband. You gave birth to 2 children from him. You're trying to pass them off as mine. Am I missing anything? Sorry, I didn't mean for my opening remarks to sound like that. I know I did wrong in your eyes. I know you feel betrayed. I know you've heard things that seem to make everything worse than it really is. Please give me a chance to explain. Please. You have 10 minutes. Explain everything if you want, I said, looking at my watch. Kim winced. You know how much I wanted a child. You know when we found out your test results, how devastated I was. I would do anything to have a child. And you obviously did. I said dryly. Please, no more sarcasm. Give me 10 minutes, will you? Kim snapped. Okay, you have 9 minutes, continue. I snapped back. I was so upset about this situation that I cried on Betty's shoulder every day. I was so jealous of their apparent ease in having children. I often told her how wonderful it would be to have children with a man as courageous as Brian, said Kim. Betty finally came to me and told me that she and Brian had decided to give me the greatest gift in the world. Betty suggested that I use Brian to have a baby. Brian wasn't in favor of this for a long time. Brian was worried about his friendship with you. Betty had to intimidate him into submission. It took me another 2 months to agree to Betty's idea. Kim sighed. The first 2 times we tried to have a child were unsuccessful? Well, that obviously wasn't a problem later from what I heard, was it? I barked. No, that's not true. No, shut up and let me explain. Kim snapped back. I read everything I could read about how to get pregnant. The doctor gave me a pamphlet that said the more open a couple is with each other, the greater the chance of conceiving. I took this to heart. Kim continued, the next time Brian and I were together, I told him he had to do his best. He simply nodded and got to work. Kim continued, at that moment I became pregnant with Megan. Brian and I dated 2 more times after I found out I was pregnant. I thought that was the end of it. I gave birth to Megan. You were the loving father I knew you would be. Brian was happy to be a trusted father again. Betty was happy that she could help us. All was good. That was until I decided to have another child. I looked at her and shook my head. Did you really think that I would agree to be the fictitious father of an illegitimate child? You don't know me very well, do you? Kim smiled. Oh dear, I know you very well. I know that you are committed to Christian values, even if you don't go to church every Sunday. I never expected you to find out about me and Brian. In any case, I decided to have another child. Brian and Betty were all for it. I think you heard Betty's phone call to me about getting together for a 4th try. Brian and I had sex that day. When I got home, I was still excited. Do you remember that night when we had the best sex of our lives? Asked Kim. Oh my God, yes, that was great. I thought you were a wild woman. I was reminiscing. Suddenly it dawned on me. You mean you were with Brian earlier that day, and I had some sloppy seconds? Kim nodded, but then said, it wasn't a sloppy second. I cleaned myself up, and many hours passed after that when I actually attacked you. I wouldn't do that to you. Did you let me? I faltered. How could you think so badly of me? My love, I didn't think so badly of you. I loved you and wanted you to experience the same heights that I had earlier that day. Kim exclaimed. Kim then continued. After some time, I found out that I was pregnant again. Brian and I met 2 more times to celebrate our creation. Then it was all over. Kim tried to explain the contents of the audio tape. As part of our sessions, Brian and I began talking nonsense to each other to stimulate higher and higher levels of response. That's what you heard on that audio recording you made. She just sat and looked at me, letting her words sink into my brain. Kim, you can call it celebrating, but I call it sex. You can call it sessions, but I call it cheating. You may still think that what you did was okay because you had good reasons. But this is not normal. Have you ever thought about what might happen if you and I experimented with these heightened responses? My chances of becoming a father are low. This doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe if we had the opportunity to experience the heights that Brian experienced, you could get pregnant from me. Have you ever thought about this? The marriage is over, Kim. I could never make love to you again, even if I wanted to. All I can think about is that Brian got there first. Goodbye. I turned around again and stared at her. You asked me for Christian forgiveness. I can't give this to you. What I will do is forget that I ever knew you. It may take years, but I will forget you. So go and ask your God for forgiveness. You won't get anything here. With that, I stood up and left Kim sitting in the booth. She put her head in her hands as I left the pub. I settled in a small apartment that I could rent for a month. I was just a few minutes' walk from my office. So I used to leave my car in the driveway and walk to and from work. I was still angry about how Kim had seemingly ruined our marriage. Did she really think that I would never know, or maybe she wouldn't care when I found out? One evening, while returning home from the office, I saw someone sitting on the porch step of my apartment. It was Kim. She looked very tired and without makeup. She was wearing old jeans and a sweatshirt that was 3 sizes too big for her. She stood up when I approached. Dan, can I talk to you for a minute? About what? Betty disowned me as a sister. My own mother and father treat me like a leper, and most people in our church treat me like an unclean pagan. I have no one to turn to now. I know I don't deserve this in your eyes, but can I ask you a favor? What about asshole Brian? Make him help you, I yelled at her. I can't. He left the city and will not return here again. Kim cried. I need you. Whether you like it or not, you are Megan's real father. Brian was just the means I used to conceive Megan. He's not her father. This is true. Can't you see it? No, and I never will. I shot back at her. I can tell you why you heard those things on tape. You're wrong about a lot of things about Brian and me. If you let me explain, I'm sure we can work things out and be happy again, she pleaded. Are you saying that I'm wrong? That Brian got you pregnant? Not once, but twice. And I'm wrong that you tried to pass off the child as mine. Let me say it again. I never want to talk about your deception. Never. I'm slowly healing, and I certainly don't need you opening up my wounds and scars again. Kim lowered her head and whispered, I'm sorry. I won't bring this up again, but I need help with Megan, and you're the only one I can turn to. What's wrong with Megan? I asked. She's been a real badass ever since you told her you weren't her daddy. She gets into fights with other kids in her class. She rebels against any babysitter I try to use, so much so that no one in the area will sit with her anymore when I need her, Kim admitted. Can you watch her for a few hours 2 days a week? I know it's a lot to ask, but Megan loves you, and I know you love her. Kim begged. What are you going to do while I babysit Megan? I barked at her. Kim sighed. I don't even deign to answer this question. I need to go to the doctor's office for a newborn checkup. And you want me to look after Megan while you get tested for Brian's latest illegitimate child? What gives you the right to ask me this? Kim lowered her head in defeat and turned to leave. I thought for a second and then shouted to her, Kim, I will look after Megan because I really love her. This is for Megan, not for you, okay? Maybe I can help her deal with this bad behavior she is doing. Kim turned around and a small smile played on her lips. Thank you, Dan. Deep down, you're still a good person. I'm so sorry for what I turned you into. 2 days later, Kim delivered Megan to me. Since I was so close to home from the office, it was easy to take a couple of hours off early and babysit. Megan ran to my front door when I opened it and jumped into my arms. She hugged me and muttered, Oh, Daddy, I missed you so much. I settled her down and talked to her about how she misbehaves with other people. She looked at me and nodded her head and then said, Dad, can you come home now? I miss you. I almost cried. I touched her lips with my finger and said, Megan, you can't say that. I'm not your dad. Brian is your dad. Do you remember our previous conversation? Megan frowned and said, But Mom says Uncle Brian was only there for me to be born, but you're my real dad. She says, You are my real dad in all the ways that really matter. I shook my head. No, honey, this is wrong. I'm nothing more than an unclee to you. Your dad is Brian. Megan cried herself to sleep on my cooch. What nonsensey is Kim filling this kid's head with? I thought about it. No wonder the child is acting up. She must be confused by all the important people in her life telling her contradictory things. When Kim returned from the doctor, I loudly argued with her about what she was still saying to Megan. Kim, you still can't be honest, can you? Brian is Megan's father, not me. So stop filling her head with this nonsense about me being her father. Kim shook her head. Dan, you are Megan's father in every way, shape, and form that is important to a little girl. She is your daughter, even if you refuse to acknowledge her as such. Brian was simply a convenient method of insemination. I started laughing. Give me a break. I heard you two whispering sweet nothings to each other. I heard you admit that you were a fool, even after fertilization. So don't bullshit me. The same scene played out for the next 6 weeks straight. Megan still said the words to her mother that I was her father. Megan became more and more confused and hostile. I finally figured out the whole situation when Kim came to pick up Megan in week 6. Kim, I can't watch Megan anymore. All this nonsense you fill her head with about me being her father is just poisoning her and me. Let someone else watch her because I just can't stand to see her being torn apart like this anymore." There was now a sadness in Kim's sad eyes that I had never seen before. "Okay, Dan. You win. Tonight I will tell her that Brian is her father, and you are not. Are you happy now?" "No, Kim, I'm not happy. But what must be done must be done. Maybe we can arrange a few more visits with me after the shock she gets from talking to you about this. I still love it." "I don't think so." Kim stopped me. "You are either in her life or you are not. I can't do this anymore either. I'll ask Mom to look after her. Do not do that. You know your mom has been drinking too much lately." "I wouldn't trust her to look after a small child," I said. She just looked at me, turned, and walked away. With that, she drove Megan home. And that was the last time I saw Megan. The following week, Kim asked her mother to look after Megan since no one else would do it. Kim had a late afternoon appointment with her OB/GYN. She had trouble carrying the baby to term due to stress caused by lack of sleep, emotional trauma, and poor diet. She asked her mother to pick Megan up from school and babysit her at my old home. As I mentioned earlier, her mom apparently became addicted to alcohol because of Kim and Betty's fight. Her mom was drunk when she picked Megan up. She drove straight through a red light and was hit 18-wheeler by a truck. Her mother died instantly. Megan was in a coma for 3 weeks before dying. I went to see Megan every day. I held her hand, read her favorite stories, and brushed her hair. I was her daddy for those 3 weeks. I stood on one side of Megan's coffin and looked at Kim on the other side. She looked at me through her tears, and I mouthed, "You killed her. You've made more bad decisions." Kim collapsed and sobbed uncontrollably. She was committed to a psychiatric facility for a month after the funeral. Her own father refused to visit her. He ranted about how Kim was responsible for the loss of his wife and granddaughter. He died 2 months after the funeral. He left a note blaming Kim for being the sole reason for his depression. Betty never forgave Kim for her part in the death of their mother and father. Kim and Brian had a baby, a boy, but Kim didn't even understand what was happening. Mentally, she lived somewhere else, and at another time. Betty took custody of the child. His name was Daniel Bryan Fanning. Apparently, Betty retained her sense of humor by naming the baby after her ex-husband and me. 3 years later, the child had a blood test before enrolling in preschool. You know what? His blood type was AB. Apparently, that one night where Kim brought me to the sexual heights she enjoyed with Brian was enough to turn my rare little swimmers into supermen. It's a shame Kim will never know about this. The Institute says that every day she is moving further and further away from reality. I wonder what she dreams about every day. I wonder if she dreams about our life together or about her time with Brian. Betty made sure that Daniel was a big part of his Uncle Daniel's life. I thank her for this. We started inviting Danny over for dinner once or twice a week. Betty is a good woman. My name is Kimberly Fanning. My husband, or ex-Dan Fanning. So, I made my last big mistake. In fact, this is the biggest mistake I've ever made. I turned over the care of my little girl to my mother while I went to the doctor. And I have to admit, I knew she was drunk the last time she picked Megan up. I just didn't want to admit it. As you already know, Mom ran a red light and was hit by a big truck. She was killed instantly, just like my little girl. My baby, the meaning of my life, was seriously injured and was in a coma for almost a month. I couldn't go to the hospital to see her because I knew it was my fault. My world collapsed when I finally realized that this whole sad story was my fault. I knew Dan spent every day with Megan. He read to her, combed her hair, washed her face, and just loved her. He loved her like a father should. I think that moment when she died in his arms, he realized that he had missed the chance to be her father forever. I was crushed by her death and teetered on the edge of a black abyss. At the funeral, Dan stared at me with venom in his eyes. Dan, still angry beyond words at me for failing to keep Megan safe and for my affair with Brian, spoke a few words across Megan's coffin. He said, "It's all your fault. You killed her." I completely broke down, and people had to help me move away from the grave. Yes, I killed her, just like I killed my mother. Just a few days later, I looked inside myself and saw this peaceful place. This place had a beautiful pond, pastures with golden flowers, an ever-shining sunny sky, and a beautiful home with Dan, Megan, our new boy Jonathan, my mom, Dad, and Betty. We were all happy, always laughing and hugging. I went there to live in my imagination. I don't remember anything from the real world because, as I was told, almost 6 years have passed. I do remember fragments of the dream world. I remember making love to Dan only to have his face and body turn into Brian's. After it was over, he turned back into Dan, who hugged me and stroked my hair. Why is Brian interfering with my wonderful life? I often asked myself in that dream world. I vaguely remember that one day while I was playing with my children, Dan came up and said, "Please forgive me. I was wrong and I forgive you for everything." It didn't make any sense to me at the time. One day I was making love to Dan and he turned into Brian, and I asked him, "Why are you here? I don't want you. I want Dan." He laughed in response and said, "This is your dream, not mine. I'm here because you still think about me and about what we once did with each other." I jumped up and shouted, "No! Dan and my children are my life. Now you have nothing to do with this. Leave." And with these words, he disappeared into oblivion. I didn't actually say that. I tried, but it had been years since I'd said anything, and my vocal cords just weren't working yet. But I still sat up straight on the bed and suddenly discovered that I had returned to reality. Needless to say, the doctors were amazed that I had found my way back after all these years. They slowly opened me up to the world again. One day I remembered all the pain that had been caused to Dan, Megan, and Mom. And I burst into tears. The doctor said it was good. I had to let it out and let it go. A week later, I was told that my father had died after my mother died. I was very sad about this. They only told me some time later that he left a note blaming me for his death, the death of my mother and my daughter. By then, I was emotionally strong enough to deal with it, and I actually did. I have long since forgiven myself for my errors in judgment that led to the disastrous life I had when I retreated into the world of illusions. About 4 days after I returned to the real world, it suddenly dawned on me that the last thing I remembered was being pregnant. I asked the doctor about my child. He cleared his throat and said, "Yes, you gave birth to a boy. He is now just over 5 years old and lives with his father." "Brian took my baby?" I exclaimed in panic. "Where is he?" The doctor looked confused. "No, I don't know any Brian. A child with your ex-husband, Dan." "What? I don't believe it. How did Dan end up with my child?" I howled. "Well, he is the father. Therefore, he declared his right to take over the boy's upbringing." "What do you mean? Brian is the child's father. Dan has nothing to do with it. This child is not Dana." The doctor looked almost surprised. "Kim, calm down. I don't know what's so confusing to you, but unless the DNA test is completely inaccurate, your ex-husband, Dan, is 98% likely to be the baby's father." I was completely confused. How could Dan be the father? I gathered my courage and asked, "Can I see my little boy sometime?" "What's his name? What does he look like?" The nurse accompanying the doctor came forward and said, "His name is Daniel Bryan Fanning. He looks a lot like his father." "Daniel Bryan Fanning? Who named him Brian?" "Well, I think it was young Daniel's stepmother. Her name is Betty. You know that she is very similar to you," the nurse answered. "Betty married my Dan? My sister married my husband?" I shook my head, trying to understand what they were saying to me. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was your sister. But yes, I believe that is exactly what happened." "You still haven't answered my question. Is there any way to see my son?" I asked carefully. I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Well, yes. We were just waiting for you to remember the fact that you had a child and realize that he was already over 5 years old," said the doctor. He continued, "Mr. and Mrs. Fanning have actually brought Daniel to you for each of his birthdays since you had him. They point at you and tell him that you are his real mother and that you love him, but you are very sick. He actually kissed you every time and told you he loved you. I was thunderstruck." The doctor walked towards the door and said, "I'll call Mr. Fanning right now and see if I can arrange a visit. He and his wife were very interested in yours recovery, and since they have been appointed as your medical guardians, they have every right to be aware of your status." "My medical caregivers? Did they make medical decisions on my behalf? Why would they do this? I just couldn't understand what was happening." 2 days passed before a visit could be arranged, and I was on pins and needles awaiting their arrival. The nurse brought her makeup bag, and we worked all morning to make me look presentable. I was now wearing a cute tracksuit that hid my skinny body. The doctors kept me alive, but I lost tons of weight while I was out. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were due to arrive any minute. I was nervous and scared. What can I tell Dan, or tell Betty, or tell my child whom I have never met? I was still pondering these questions when the door swung open and a small ball of pure energy, about 3.5 feet tall, flew in. He looked exactly like Dan. He burst in shouting, "Mommy, Mommy, are you really awakey?" He ran up to me, and I hugged him with all the strength I could muster. I kissed at his face, and he kissed me back. Finally, I said, "Yes, baby, I woke up. I'm sorry I was so sick." He pulled back a little and looked into my eyes. "Dad said that you will come back to us someday." He was right. Isn't that right, Dad? He turned and looked at the door. Dan was standing there. A slightly more complete and older version than I remember, but still my Dan. He smiled and answered, laughing, "I bet, partner." I started to speak when Betty came out from behind Dan and grabbed his hand. She looked at me and smiled. "Hi, sister. It was so long ago." I gasped. She called me little sister. I couldn't understand. She was so angry with me the last time I saw her. Dan and Betty walked up to the bed, holding each other's hands. "We're so glad you're with us again," Dan exclaimed. Betty laughed and kissed the back of my hand. Now I was completely lost. Dan hated me. I disgraced our marriage and he left me. I screwed up again by letting my mother look after Megan, and as such I was responsible for her death. How could these two be so happy to see me? I hesitantly said hello and asked them this question when I started crying. Dan squeezed my hand and said, "Many years later, the pain of it all is long gone. Betty convinced me that I had to forgive you, otherwise she wouldn't have married me. I must have looked depressed because Betty said, 'Sis, I know it seems like yesterday to you, but almost 6 years have passed it. I had kids who needed a father, and Dan had your boy who needed a mother. We both felt the same pain from the results of my terrible idea. We both needed to be held and wanted. It took Dan quite a long time to even trust me after my role in this whole fiasco, but in the end, he forgave me. I've already forgiven you since I was the one who brought you and Brian together. I had to forgive you, before I could forgive myself." Betty paused long enough to calm herself, and then continued. "When Dan asked me to marry him, I could tell he still had the bitterness that would ultimately destroy him and the family he so desperately wanted. I worked with him for several months, showing him that the entire set of events was not, in fact, someone's intentional act. Everything that happened, it just got out of control. He really knows that you adored him, even when you were with Brian. One day he finally came to you, and although you didn't hear him, he asked for your forgiveness. I remember this. At that time, it was just a random event that imposed itself on the world of my dreams. But I remember Dan asking me for forgiveness and granting me his forgiveness," I said excitedly. Dan smiled and said, "Absolutely right. You've been here sometimes, haven't you?" Betty continued, "Sis, I'm now married to Dan. We love each other. We are raising a group of wonderful children. Your baby is very dear to us. But we understand that a mother needs to be close to her son and know him. That's why we suggest you spend time with your little one every weekend. Daniel, and you can come to our holiday meetings." I should have known this and tried to ask, how come little Daniel is considered Dan's son? I mean, me and Brian, Brian and Dan laughed. Well, Kim, it looks like even though he tried, I was the one who did it. Apparently, that one night of extreme passion we had was enough for you to give birth to the child you so desperately wanted. Betty squeezed my hand to get my attention and said, 2 years ago, we had our own child, little Sarah, and I'm pregnant again. I lay back on the bed pillow and thought about everything. If I asked Dan for money, artificial fertilization, or if I had taken a clinical approach with Brian without passion, or if I had not wanted a second child, or if I had simply tried to warm up my loving husband, as I did with Brian, none of this would have happened. I sighed and thought, if only, if only. As my grandfather told me, make a wish in one hand, spit in the other, and see which one is filled first. But I was determined to do better, and be the moral person I knew I could be. I accepted their offer and spent many happy times in their home, playing with the children and loving my son. I met a very nice man named Henry. He worked for Dan, and Dan always thought he would be good for me. He also wanted children. We're getting married in 2 weeks. After all, he must make me an honest woman. Yes, I'm pregnant. My doctor tells me it's twins. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.